The Sound of Deceit. An affair and a cold-blooded revenge. The first gift my husband Richard gave me after he destroyed my life was a can of WD-40. He placed it on the kitchen counter, right next to the vase of roses I had just cut from the garden, and said with a cold smile, "So you'll never have to hear him leaving again." My husband, Richard, never fixed the squeaky hinge on our back garden gate. For years, it was a minor, persistent annoyance, a topic of conversation that would rise and fall like the tide. I'd mention it over a silent breakfast, and he would nod vaguely into his newspaper. "I'll get to it," he'd murmur, the words a placating puff of air, forgotten as soon as they were spoken. The grating shriek of rusted metal became a part of our domestic soundscape, as familiar as the hum of the refrigerator or the distant moan of the 7:15 a.m. train. I thought it was a symbol of our marriage, a small fixable problem left to decay through simple neglect. Now I know the truth, a truth so cold and meticulously crafted it chills the very marrow in my bones. He didn't neglect the hinge. He cultivated it. He allowed the rain and humidity to work their corrosive magic, listening to its pitch change with the seasons. He wanted that sound, that specific, agonizing cry. It wasn't a sign of his indifference. It was his instrument, his alarm. A signal so perfectly tuned to my betrayal that he would always know the precise moment my lover was stepping out of his world and back into mine. Welcome back to our storytelling channel. If you believe that the quietest suburbs often hide the most turbulent secrets, and that the human heart is a landscape of endless complexity, you've come to the right place. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And now, let's settle in and listen to Evelyn's account. Life on Primrose Lane is by design an exercise in placid perfection. We are a community of manicured lawns, identical mailboxes that get a fresh coat of paint every other spring, and friendly surface-level waves exchanged during the morning paper run. Richard and I, at 62 and 64 respectively, were the street's seasoned veterans, a portrait of quiet, respectable longevity. To our neighbours, we were the Petersons. Richard and Evelyn, a single solid entity. He, a retired architect, spent his days in a detached workshop, a place that always smelled of cedar shavings and turpentine. I, in turn, was the curator of our home and garden, a domestic historian tending to the artifacts of a life well lived. We had a history rich with texture. I remembered our 30th anniversary, a weekend spent in a small windswept inn on the Oregon coast. Richard had held my hand during the entire dinner, his thumb tracing patterns on my skin, his eyes so focused on me it felt as though I were the only person in the room. He had recited a poem by Neruda from memory, his voice a low, warm rumble against the sound of the crashing waves outside. That night, I had felt so utterly and completely seen, as if the very essence of my being was cherished. I contrasted that vibrant memory with our 40th anniversary, just last year. We went to the same upscale restaurant downtown we'd been to a dozen times. The silence between us was broken only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain. He talked about the stock market. I talked about the blight on the azaleas. We were two business partners reviewing the quarterly reports of our shared enterprise, Peterson LLC. There was no poetry. He didn't reach for my hand. His gaze was distant, directed somewhere over my shoulder. The feeling of being cherished had been replaced by a quiet, orderly sense of being managed. This was the soul erosion that had defined our last decade. We hadn't fallen out of love with a dramatic crash. We had simply drifted apart on a soul-silent current of routine and unspoken resentments. I had become invisible. A familiar piece of furniture Richard navigated around but no longer truly saw. My own reflection in the hallway mirror seemed to agree, showing me a woman whose edges were fading, blurring into the floral wallpaper behind her. And then there was Daniel. Daniel lived next door. His wife, Martha, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes, had been taken by cancer 3 years prior, leaving a silence in his house that was as profound as the one in mine. He was a retired literature professor, a man whose gentle eyes held the weight of the 1,000 stories he'd read and the one great tragedy he had lived. Our friendship began innocently. A series of small negotiations across the low picket fence that separated our properties. He'd praised the deep velvety red of my prize-winning roses, not with a simple nice flowers, but with a thoughtful comment. "That shade of crimson, Evelyn," he'd said once. "It's almost heartbreaking." Like a line from a Lorca poem. My heart had fluttered at that. Lorca. Richard and I hadn't discussed poetry in 20 years. Those brief exchanges were like sips of cool water in a desert. They slowly blossomed into longer talks, then invitations for iced tea on his shaded porch. We talked about everything and nothing. The migrating patterns of monarch butterflies, the disappointments of modern politics, the aching beauty of a Robert Frost poem. With Richard, my thoughts felt trivial, unspoken. With Daniel, they felt worthy. He didn't just hear my words, he listened to the music behind them. He saw the woman I used to be, the woman I still was, buried beneath layers of quiet resignation. The betrayal wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event. It crept in like the morning fog, soft and silent, blurring the hard lines of right and wrong until I could no longer see them clearly. It started with a touch, his hand on mine, holding on a second too long after he helped me steady a wobbly stepladder. It was a simple grounding pressure, but it sent a jolt through a system that had been dormant for a decade. Then came the hugs at the end of our visits. No longer the perfunctory pats of neighbors, but full, lingering embraces where I could feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart against my cheek, his scent of old books and Earl Grey tea filling my senses. The point of no return came on a sweltering July afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, silencing the birds and cicadas. Richard was in his workshop. The high-pitched whine of his table saw the only sound piercing the oppressive stillness. I stood at my kitchen window, watching Daniel water his hydrangeas, his back to me. And in that moment, a powerful, undeniable current pulled me forward. It was a force born of 1,000 lonely nights and 1,000,000 unspoken words. My body moved before my mind could object. I walked out my back door, across the 10 feet of perfectly green lawn, and through my garden gate. The hinge let out its familiar, painful squeak. Screech. A sound that split the humid air. I crossed his yard and stepped into the cool dimness of his kitchen. He stood by the window, a glass of water in his hand, still looking out. He didn't need to turn around to know it was me. The air itself had changed. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. I couldn't speak. I simply walked up behind him and laid my hand flat on the warm, solid expanse of his back. That single point of contact was a confession. It held all my loneliness, all my hunger, all my guilt. When he turned to face me, the look in his eyes was not one of surprise, but of recognition. He saw a mirror of his own quiet grief, his own deep-seated need for connection. Our affair was a world built in the quiet hours of weekday afternoons. His house became my sanctuary. It was a different universe from my own meticulously ordered home. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams that slanted through his study windows, illuminating shelves overflowing with books, stacked too deep. A half-finished crossword puzzle was always on the table, a mug of cold coffee beside it. It was a space that was lived in, a space that held the comfortable chaos of a life of the mind. My own home felt like a showroom. Dwars felt like a library of the soul. The time I spent with him was a desperate act of reclamation. I was reclaiming the woman who loved to talk about art, who could lose herself in a piece of music, who felt a thrill at the touch of a man's hand. Each meeting was a dive into deep, clear water after walking through a desert. The craving for it was a physical ache in my chest during the long, silent evenings with Richard. I'd sit across from him at the dinner table, pushing food around my plate, and my mind would be next door. I'd be replaying a conversation with Daniel, feeling the phantom warmth of his hand on the small of my back. It was an addiction, and the substance I craved was not sex, but significance. The feeling of mattering to someone. The physical part of our relationship was an extension of that craving. It was a language my body had nearly forgotten, and was now relearning with a desperate, hungry fluency. I remember one afternoon, the light outside turning golden. We were in his study, a vinyl record of a Bach cello suite playing softly. He led me to his worn leather armchair, and instead of taking me with a desperate urgency, he simply knelt before me. He took my hands in his, turned them over, and began to trace the lines on my palms with his fingertip, his gaze intense, as if he were deciphering a sacred text. "The lines of a life," he'd whispered. "All the places you've been, all the things you've held." In that moment, I wasn't a 62-year-old woman with crow's feet and age spots. I was a map of a wondrous country he was determined to explore. When he finally kissed me, it felt less like a prelude to sex and more like an act of worship. Our intimacy was like that, a slow, reverent exploration. It was the undoing of years of feeling unseen. It was two quiet people creating a space where they could finally be loud in their own way. Their bodies speaking the truths their lonely lives had forced them to suppress. It was a parched, dormant garden finally receiving a slow, soaking rain. The thirsty roots drinking so deeply it felt like a miracle. One day, the risk of it all became terrifyingly real. We were in his living room, lost in conversation, when we heard the sound of Richard's car pulling into our driveway, hours earlier than expected. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me. We froze, our eyes locked in panic. I scrambled for my shoes, my heart hammering against my ribs. I fled out his back door, stumbling across the lawn like a frightened teenager. As I yanked my garden gate open, the screech it made sounded like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. I slipped into my house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. just as Richard walked in the front door, whistling. He glanced at me, his eyes unreadable. "You look flushed, Evelyn. Too much sun." I mumbled an excuse about gardening, my lies feeling like ash in my mouth. That night, the fear was overshadowed by a reckless thrill. We had almost been caught, and the danger only intensified the preciousness of our stolen world. Throughout it all, Richard remained an island of oblivious calm. His apparent lack of suspicion became, in my twisted logic, a form of permission. His distance was the soil in which my betrayal had taken root and grown. My guilt, sharp and piercing at first, slowly dulled, replaced by a low-grade resentment. He had built the wall between us. His neglect had unlocked the gate. A story like this forced us to question our own certainties. As you listen to Evelyn's justifications, do you find yourself sympathizing with her, or does the betrayal overshadow everything? Our audience is often split right down the middle, and opinions tend to shift dramatically as the story unfolds. Let us know your initial thoughts in the comments below. The unraveling did not come with a bang. There was no lipstick on a collar, no suspicious phone call. It arrived on a quiet Sunday evening, delivered with the casual indifference of a weather report. We were in the living room, the television murmuring in the background, another comfortable silence stretching between us. Richard folded his newspaper, placing it precisely on the coffee table, a habit of his that suddenly seemed menacing. "I sold the house, darling," he said. The book in my lap slid to the floor with a soft thud. The room seemed to tilt, the familiar patterns on the Persian rug swimming before my eyes. My first thought was not guilt, but a dizzying internal protest. No, he can't. My garden, the fence. Daniel. You what? I managed, my voice a strangled squeak. Sold the house? What are you talking about, Richard? Why? You can't just decide that. He finally looked at me, and truly looked at me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was no anger in his gaze. There was no sadness. There was something far more terrifying. A vast, chilling emptiness, like a frozen lake. "I think it's time for a change," he said, his voice unnervingly level. A fresh start, somewhere new. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. "But this is our home. My garden is here. We've lived on this street for 30 years. The words tumbled out, a frantic defense of the life I had so carefully compartmentalized. This wasn't about him. It was about the geography of my affair. He was threatening my sanctuary. "You love your garden," he repeated slowly, a strange emphasis on the word. "Or do you love the gate at the back of it? The one that leads to the garden next door?" The world fractured. It was a clean, sharp break, like a pane of glass struck by a stone. The air was sucked from my lungs. The hum of the television, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It all faded into a deafening roar in my ears. He knows. The thought wasn't a whisper. It was a scream that ricocheted around the inside of my skull. He knows. He knows. He knows. My mind scrambled for a foothold, for a lie, for any plausible deniability. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, the words flimsy and transparent even to my own ears. A dry, mirthless chuckle escaped his lips. It was a horrifying sound. "Oh, I think you do, Evelyn. I know. I've known for a very long time." His calmness was the most brutal part. A shouting match I could handle. Tears, accusations, those were familiar territories in a marriage. But this cold, placid certainty, it was alien. It disarmed me completely. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. "Oh, how long?" I whispered, the words scraping my raw throat. "Since the first time," he answered, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "That Tuesday in July last year. You thought I was at the club until 6. I came home early. I was in the workshop. I heard the gate. The squeak. Evelyn. It's a very distinctive sound. I saw you go. I saw you come back hours later, your face flushed, your hair slightly mussed. I've been aware of every single visit since." I fell back into the armchair, the plush fabric offering no comfort, only swallowing me in my shame. Every memory of the past year was instantly recontextualized. Every silent dinner, every polite question, every moment of his seeming indifference was now cast in a new sinister light. He hadn't been oblivious. He had been observing, collecting data. A cold fury began to mix with my terror. He had let me do this. He had watched me do this. "Why?" I choked out. "Why didn't you say anything? Why let it go on?" "Because," he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes boring into mine. "An immediate reaction is emotional. A delayed reaction is strategic." My blood ran cold. The quiet, predictable man I thought I knew had vanished. In his place was a stranger, a master strategist whose patience was both terrifying and, to my horror, impressive. "So, what are you going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling, bracing for the inevitable. "Do? It's already done," he said. "The hard part is over. Daniel is moving. He received a very generous all-cash offer for his house last month, one he simply couldn't refuse. He's closing at the end of the week." A new wave of confusion washed over my despair. It was a dizzying cocktail of emotions. Relief that we weren't going to be publicly shamed. Bafflement at this new development. Who bought it?" Richard allowed himself a small, tight smile. It was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen. It didn't reach his eyes. "I did, Evelyn. Through a shell corporation. He has no idea who the new owner is. He just thinks he got lucky. He was so excited to tell me the good news over the fence last week. The irony's quite something, isn't it?" And there it was. His revenge? Not a messy, passionate explosion, but a quiet, elegant, and exquisitely cruel act of psychological warfare. He hadn't destroyed our marriage. He knew there was nothing left to destroy. He had systematically dismantled my escape. He had purchased my sanctuary, not to occupy it, but to render it empty. He had lied about selling our house, of course. That was just the opening salvo, a way to destabilize me, to make me panic. His real plan was far more devastating. He intended for us to stay right here, in our perfect house on Primrose Lane. Though he was trapping me. He was sentencing me to a life of looking out my kitchen window, day after day, at the empty house next door. A constant, glaring reminder of the happiness I had found and lost. He hadn't just taken Daniel away from me. He had taken away my hope. Our final true confrontation happened the night before Daniel was set to leave. I had moved past shock and into a desperate, cornered rage. I hurled every accusation at him I could think of. He was a monster, a fiend, a coward for not facing me sooner. He listened patiently, his hands steepled before him, waiting for the storm to pass. When I was finished, breathing in ragged gasps, my throat raw, he finally spoke. His voice low and heavy with a sorrow that cut deeper than any anger could have. "You think this is about hate, Evelyn? Hate is a hot, messy emotion. This is about balance. It's about grief. You didn't just sleep with another man. You slept with my friend, a man I shared beers with, a man I mourned with when his wife died. You brought your affair into our home, into our neighborhood. You took the one place on earth I felt grounded, my home, my workshop, and you turned it into the backdrop for your deception. Every time I heard that gate squeak, it was a physical blow. It was the sound of my life being dismantled, piece by rusted piece. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness where Daniel's porch light cast a lonely glow. I didn't want to destroy you, Evelyn. I just wanted you to feel exactly what I've felt this past year. I wanted you to sit in this house and feel the same crushing emptiness. I wanted you to be surrounded by the beautiful things we collected over 40 years and feel absolutely nothing. I wanted you to be suffocated by the same silence that you created. Now, you will be. The next morning, I watched from behind the living room curtains as the moving truck pulled away from Daniel's curb. The faceless movers slammed the big metal door shut with a deafening clang. Daniel got into his car, and for a moment, I thought he might look over. A final glance. A shared silent acknowledgement of the beautiful, fragile world we had built and lost. But he never did. He just put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving a perfectly manicured lawn and a hollow space on our street and in my life. The silence in our home is different now. It's no longer a passive absence of sound. It is an active, malevolent presence. It is a monument to our ruin. Richard is in his workshop. I am in my garden. But between us lies the empty house, a void that speaks volumes, a testament to a quiet man's devastatingly patient rage. This morning, I heard a noise from the back garden. It was Richard. He was wearing his work gloves, holding a can of lubricant. He knelt by the gate, and with the careful precision of the architect he once was, he worked on the hinge. A few minutes later, he came back inside, wiping his hands on a rag. I waited an hour before I went out to look. The air was cool. The sun was bright. I put my hand on the familiar wood of the gate. I pushed it open. It swung smoothly, effortlessly, without a sound. His revenge is complete. The silence of that hinge is now the loudest sound I've ever heard. He hasn't locked me in a cage. He has created a prison of memory and regret, a pristine suburban hell. And I am its only inmate, sentenced to a lifetime of looking at the ghost of a life I briefly touched, forever haunted by the deafening silence of a gate that no longer squeaks. And that is where Evelyn's story leaves us, in a quiet suburban street filled with unspoken agony. In a war of hearts, can there ever be a true victor? Is Richard's methodical revenge justified? Or is it a cruelty that surpasses the original betrayal? Share this story with someone you think would appreciate its complexity and let us know your final thoughts in the comments. Your engagement is what allows us to continue bringing these narratives to you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you for the next story.